The sun had just set, leaving behind a dusky blue-gray sky dotted with the shimmering lights of the city. Clara, a 24-year-old woman, was busy preparing for her evening shift at a high-end restaurant downtown. Though her legs often ached from standing all day, her face still carried a gentle smile. Life for Clara was far from easy. Her mother suffered from a chronic illness that required long-term medication, and her younger sister was in college with hefty tuition fees. The financial burden fell squarely on her shoulders. But Clara never complained. Each day, she prayed, asking God for the strength to keep going. That evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. The hum of laughter and conversation blended with the clinking of dishes and soft background music, creating a bustling yet elegant atmosphere. Clara moved swiftly, clearing tables and serving customers without pause. She poured her heart into her work, holding fast to the belief, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Colossians 3 verse 23. Amid the steady flow of patrons, Clara noticed a boy, about 13 years old, quietly walk in. He was simply dressed and chose a table in a shadowed corner near the window, where the chandelier's light only partially reached. He didn't order anything, merely asking softly for a glass of water. When Clara brought the water to him, she couldn't help but notice his trembling hands, as though he was weak from hunger or cold. His eyes held a deep sadness, but also a quiet dignity that made Clara hesitate to ask more. She set the glass down and offered a kind smile. "Here's your water. If you need anything else, just let me know." "Okay." The boy nodded slightly in thanks, then lowered his head, clutching the glass tightly. For a moment, Clara stood there, watching him, feeling a strange, stirring sensation in her heart, as if she had touched something fragile and precious. The restaurant buzzed on, yet the boy's small corner seemed completely detached from the lively atmosphere. Clara thought to herself, maybe God brought him here so I could do something for him. She didn't realize, however, that this fleeting moment would forever change her life. Clara couldn't get the boy out of her mind as she moved through the bustling restaurant. He sat alone in the shadowed corner, his small frame blending into the dimly lit background. His face, pale and weary, bore traces of exhaustion that seemed too heavy for someone his age. But it was his eyes that gripped her heart, dark, solemn, and filled with a sadness so deep it almost made her want to cry. It was as if he carried a burden too big for his young shoulders, a burden no child should ever have to bear. As she cleared a nearby table, her pastor's recent sermon echoed in her mind. "Kindness is the light that illuminates the darkness of this world." The words rang clear, nudging her forward, urging her to do something, anything, for this boy who seemed so out of place in the glittering, fast-paced world of the restaurant. Clara slipped into the kitchen, her heart racing. She pulled out her wallet, thumbing through the few bills she had left from her last paycheck. Money was tight, and she was already saving every penny to support her mother's medication and her sister's college fees. But as she handed the money to the pastry chef and pointed to the smallest, most modest item in the display, a warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't about money. It was about doing what was right. When she returned to the dining area, carrying the plate with the small pastry on it, she felt a strange mixture of nerves and determination. Approaching the boy's table, she leaned down and placed the plate gently in front of him. "Eat something, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth that she hoped would reach his tired soul. "It's cold, and you need to keep your strength up." The boy looked up at her, startled. His eyes widened in disbelief, the sadness momentarily lifting to reveal a glimmer of something she hadn't expected: hope. He hesitated for a moment, as if he couldn't believe this simple act of kindness was meant for him. Finally, he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Thank you, ma'am. I was really hungry." Clara felt her heart swell. That glimmer in his eyes, the gratitude in his voice, it made all the stress of her day and the hardships of her life fade into insignificance. For a fleeting moment, she felt weightless, as if she'd done something truly meaningful. But just as the warmth of the moment enveloped her, a voice shattered it like glass breaking against the floor. "Clara, what do you think you're doing here?" The sharpness of the tone made her flinch. Straightening up, Clara turned to see Mr. Nolan, the restaurant's manager, storming toward her. His face was flushed, his brows furrowed in fury. "Who do you think you are? Giving out free food?" he barked, his voice carrying across the room and causing heads to turn. "This restaurant isn't a place for your charity games." Clara felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck as she realized the other diners were now watching. But she refused to let her composure break. Taking a steadying breath, she met his angry gaze and said calmly, "I just wanted to help the boy. I paid for the pastry myself." Her words, spoken with quiet resolve, only seemed to fuel Nolan's anger. His face turned an even deeper shade of red as he jabbed a finger toward her, his voice rising to a roar. "I don't care if you paid for it or not. This is my restaurant, and I won't have my staff pulling stunts like this. You're fired. Effective immediately. Pack up and leave now." The room fell silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Clara could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, but she refused to let the tears forming in her eyes spill over. Instead, she lowered her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. She didn't regret what she had done, not for a second, but the humiliation cut deep, leaving her with a sting she couldn't shake. Before turning to leave, Clara knelt beside the boy once more. Ignoring Nolan's looming presence behind her, she reached out and placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, her voice soft and steady. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said gently. "Everything's going to be okay." The boy looked at her, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and gratitude. She gave him a reassuring smile before rising to her feet and walking toward the back to collect her things. As she disappeared from view, the restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath, caught between the remnants of her kindness and the harsh reality of Nolan's wrath. As Clara stepped out of the restaurant, her heart heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness, Mr. Nolan turned his attention to the boy sitting in the corner. The look on Nolan's face shifted to one of disdain, his lips curling into a sneer as he approached. "Kids like you don't belong here," Nolan said, his voice cutting through the hum of the dining room. "Don't you realize you're tarnishing the image of this restaurant?" The boy flinched at the harshness of the words but didn't reply. Instead, he looked up at Nolan with wide, tearful eyes. His small hands clenched tightly in his lap, and he bit his lower lip in an effort to stay composed. Yet his gaze betrayed the depth of his hurt, an emotion too raw and profound for someone so young. Around the room, several customers had paused their conversations. Their eyes darted toward the unfolding scene, their expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. The gentle clinking of utensils against plates slowed, and the once bustling restaurant began to grow eerily quiet. An elderly woman seated a few tables away couldn't hold her silence any longer. Adjusting her glasses, she rose to her feet, her posture straight despite her age. Her voice, calm but firm, carried through the room. "Mr. Nolan, what has this boy done to deserve such treatment? Is this how you manage a high-end restaurant, by bullying a child?" The whispers started immediately. Customers leaned toward each other, murmuring in hushed tones. Some turned their chairs slightly to get a better view of the confrontation. Others glanced at the elderly woman with nods of agreement, their disapproval of Nolan's behavior growing more evident. Nolan's jaw tightened, his face turning a deeper shade of red. "My restaurant. My rules," he snapped, his tone sharp but lacking the authority it had moments before. "If you're unhappy, you're welcome to leave too." The elderly woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his bluster. She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Around the room, more diners began to quietly gather their belongings. Chairs scraped against the floor as they stood, signaling their decision to leave. Meanwhile, the boy, his shoulders slumped, slowly stood up from his seat. His movements were hesitant, almost as if he feared that any sudden action might draw more unwanted attention. Before leaving, he turned to the elderly woman, his voice soft and trembling. "Thank you, ma'am." She gave him a kind smile, her eyes filled with compassion. "You take care of yourself, young man," she said gently. As the boy walked toward the door, his head hung low, Clara, who had been standing just outside, spotted him. Her heart ached at the sight of his small frame and the sadness etched into his expression. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You don't need to be afraid," she said, her voice soothing and steady. "None of this was your fault." The boy stopped and looked up at her, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, he didn't speak, but the way he gazed at her, his gratitude, his relief, it was all written in that single look. Finally, he nodded slightly. Amid the bustling streets outside, filled with the noise of passing cars and hurried footsteps, Clara walked alongside the boy. Neither said much, but their shared silence carried a sense of understanding. Behind them, the chaos inside the restaurant continued to escalate. Customers left in droves, their displeasure evident in their loud conversations and sharp glances. Nolan's once pristine dining room now seemed hollow and tense, a stark contrast to the warmth and kindness that had briefly touched its walls. As Clara and the boy moved further from the restaurant, the sounds of the city began to drown out the echoes of Nolan's arrogance. Yet in Clara's heart, one thing was clear. Even in the face of cruelty, there was always room for kindness. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Nolan's office as he unlocked the door and stepped inside, his mind still churning over the events of the previous night. He slammed his briefcase onto the desk, muttering under his breath. To him, the night had been a disaster, but not because of his actions, no. Nolan saw himself as the victim of an incompetent employee and an unruly child. "That Clara," he grumbled as he loosened his tie and dropped into his chair, "always bending the rules. And that boy, what was he even doing there? This isn't some soup kitchen." His irritation grew as he replayed the scene in his mind, frustrated at how it had spiraled out of his control. He had always prided himself on maintaining a strict environment, one where rules were followed and appearances were everything. But last night, he thought, had been an unwelcome challenge to his authority. The shrill ring of the desk phone broke his thoughts. He snatched it up, his tone sharp and curt. "Nolan's restaurant. This is the manager speaking. Who is this?" The voice on the other end was calm, but carried an unmistakable weight. "Good morning, Mr. Nolan. I'm a representative of the Trump family. I'm calling to discuss your actions last night toward Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump." For a moment, Nolan was certain he had misheard. His breath caught in his throat, and his hand tightened around the receiver. "Barron Trump?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the voice replied, still measured but growing colder. "Last night, your restaurant played host to a boy seeking nothing more than a moment of peace. Instead, you chose to humiliate him, making him feel insulted and deeply hurt." Nolan felt the room shrink around him. The air seemed heavier, and despite the hum of the air conditioning, beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. He struggled to find his words, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I didn't know he was Barron Trump," he stammered. "I was just enforcing the restaurant's policies." The voice on the other end cut him off, sharp and unyielding. "What policy allows you to insult a customer, particularly a child? What policy justifies trampling on basic human decency in the name of your hollow sense of prestige?" Each word landed like a blow, and Nolan could feel his chest tightening. His mind raced, searching for a way to respond, but nothing came. The voice continued, now laced with an edge of finality. "The Trump family has decided not to let this matter go unnoticed. This incident will be shared with the media, and I assure you, it will not just harm the reputation of your restaurant, but will likely mark the end of your career. We want you to fully grasp the consequences of your arrogance and lack of compassion." The line went silent before Nolan could muster a reply. Slowly, he placed the receiver back on its cradle, his hand trembling. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. His usual image of a self-assured, no-nonsense manager crumbled in an instant. The smug confidence he wore like a badge now felt like a heavy burden, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was giving way. The word Trump echoed in his mind, not just as a name but as a force, a symbol of power that he had foolishly underestimated. Now, it loomed over him like a tidal wave, ready to sweep away everything he had built. For the first time in years, Nolan felt small, insignificant even, and a gnawing fear crept into his chest. He remained motionless in his chair, staring out the window as the morning sunlight spilled into the room, mocking his despair. The storm was coming, and there was no escape. The next morning, Clara woke up to a quiet house. The light streaming through her window was soft, but it did little to ease the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She sat up slowly, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. She couldn't shake the humiliation of being fired in front of customers and coworkers. Still, she knew she wouldn't have done anything differently. The boy had needed help, and she had done what she believed was right. Yet, as much as her conscience was clear, the weight of her circumstances pressed heavily on her. Her job had been her only source of income, the lifeline that kept her mother's medical treatments ongoing and her sister in college. Losing it felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. She couldn't afford to wallow in despair, though she needed a plan, and fast. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her notebook. It was filled with notes and addresses of potential employers she had been gathering, just in case something ever went wrong. She wasn't expecting to lose her job like this, but she was prepared to fight for her family's survival. As she finished dressing and prepared to leave, her phone rang unexpectedly. The unfamiliar number on the screen made her hesitate. Who could it be? For a moment, her heart raced. Had Mr. Nolan changed his mind? Or was this some follow-up to the disastrous night at the restaurant? Finally, summoning her courage, Clara answered. "Hello, this is Clara. May I ask who's calling?" The voice that responded was warm and professional, yet carried an undertone of authority. "Good morning, Miss Clara. My name is Rachel, and I'm a representative of the Trump family. We'd like to speak with you regarding the events of last night." Clara froze in place, her fingers gripping the phone tighter. The Trump family? Why would they be calling me? A surge of fear crept into her thoughts. Is something bad about to happen? Did I offend them without realizing it? Her silence didn't last long, as the voice on the other end continued, this time with a calmness that seemed to ease Clara's nerves. "The boy you helped last night was Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump. Your actions deeply touched our family." Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Her heart pounded as she tried to comprehend what she had just heard. Barron Trump? She had no idea. He had seemed like any other boy, tired and in need. She finally managed to stammer, her voice unsteady. I only did what I thought was right. He looked so hungry and tired. Rachel interrupted gently, but this time her voice carried a genuine warmth that made Clara's chest tighten with emotion. And it's precisely because of that sincerity that the Trump family wants to express our profound gratitude. We don't just want to thank you. We also want to help you and your family. Clara blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to keep up. Gratitude? Help her family? This had to be a mistake. She shook her head, as if trying to clear her thoughts. But Rachel's words continued, grounding her in the surreal moment. Clara, you don't need to worry about losing your job, Rachel said firmly. We've arranged a new position for you at one of the Trump organization's top hotels. It's a role with a much better salary, fitting for the kindness you showed. The air seemed to leave Clara's lungs. She placed a hand over her chest, feeling her heart thudding beneath her palm. A better job? At one of their hotels? She tried to respond, but all she could manage was a breathless, I don't understand. I don't deserve this. But Rachel wasn't done. Her voice softened, carrying a tone that felt almost personal. We've also learned about your mother's illness and your sister's university expenses. The Trump family will cover all of your mother's medical bills and your sister's tuition until she graduates. This time, Clara couldn't stop the tears from spilling down her cheeks. She pressed her free hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice breaking. Thank you. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. I only did what I felt God wanted me to do. Rachel's reply was soft, almost reverent. Genuine kindness is always seen, Clara, by people and by God. The Trump family believes your actions are a testament to the compassion the world needs more of. When the call ended, Clara sat in stunned silence, her phone still clutched in her hand. Slowly, a sense of peace began to settle over her, replacing the whirlwind of anxiety and fear from the morning. She bowed her head, tears streaming down her face, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Lord, thank you for this blessing. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never wasted. Please help me to continue living with this sincere heart. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile spread across Clara's face. She wiped her tears, stood up, and looked out the window at the bright morning sun. Her burdens felt lighter, her path clearer. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it with renewed faith and hope. The morning after the infamous incident at Nolan's restaurant, the internet was ablaze with outrage. The story had spread like wildfire, not because of the restaurant's upscale menu or impeccable ambience, but because of the cruel and heartless actions of its manager. Mr. Nolan had not only publicly humiliated a young boy, but had also fired a compassionate employee who had shown an act of simple humanity. Witnesses to the scene had wasted no time sharing their accounts online, complete with vivid descriptions of Nolan's harsh words and dismissive attitude. One diner wrote on social media, "It was shocking to see a manager treat a child with such disdain, and to fire Clara, who only showed kindness. Unforgivable. I'll never step foot in that place again." Within hours, the post had gone viral, accumulating thousands of shares and comments. Soon, other diners who had been at the restaurant that evening chimed in, each offering their own perspective on the events. Many detailed how Nolan's voice had boomed across the dining room, belittling a boy who had done nothing wrong and publicly shaming Clara for an act of generosity. The backlash was swift. Major news outlets picked up the story, running headlines that captured the public's growing fury. One article read, "Restaurant manager Nolan humiliates Barron Trump. Kindness shown the door." Another asked, "When did humanity become a liability in business?" Social media was inundated with critical comments, the outrage palpable in every post. "This restaurant doesn't deserve a single penny from us," wrote one user. "How can a manager behave so inhumanely?" commented another. "Kindness should be protected, not punished," declared a popular tweet that was retweeted thousands of times. The mainstream media seized the opportunity to delve deeper into the story. One prominent news channel aired an exclusive interview with a customer who had witnessed the incident firsthand. The woman, visibly upset, recounted the moment Nolan berated the boy. "It wasn't just about a manager being strict," she said, shaking her head. "It was about basic human decency, or the lack of it." Nolan didn't just insult the boy. He stripped away what it means to be compassionate. This isn't just poor management, it's a lesson in how not to treat people. As the public outrage grew, so did the consequences for Nolan's restaurant. Loyal patrons began canceling reservations, and the once busy dining room was now eerily empty. The restaurant's social media accounts were flooded with negative reviews, with users giving it one-star ratings and scathing comments like, "Don't support a business run by a bully," and "This place is a disgrace." Business partners quickly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their reputations by association. Suppliers began pulling contracts, and sponsorships for future events were quietly withdrawn. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Foot traffic dwindled, and revenue plummeted at a rate no one could have anticipated. Inside his office, Nolan sat in stunned silence, his world unraveling around him. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the desk, the screen lighting up with hundreds of missed calls and unread messages. Each notification was a fresh wave of condemnation, scathing criticisms demanding his resignation, furious complaints from former customers, and pleas from business associates urging him to step down. But what shook him the most was the letter he received that afternoon. The envelope bore the unmistakable emblem of the Trump family. With trembling hands, Nolan opened it, his stomach sinking as he read the contents. The letter was clear and uncompromising. The Trump family would not let this matter rest. They intended to pursue legal action if necessary and had already begun taking steps to ensure the story received widespread attention. The pressure mounted with each passing hour, leaving Nolan no choice but to act. Under the weight of public outrage, collapsing revenue, and the looming threat of legal consequences, he scheduled a press conference to address the scandal. When the day arrived, Nolan stood before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing relentlessly. His once pristine suit now looked wrinkled, and the confident demeanor he was known for had vanished, replaced by a man visibly worn down by his circumstances. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "I extend my sincerest apologies to Barron Trump, the Trump family, and Clara," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My actions were inappropriate, and I take full responsibility for the consequences." Though his words were spoken with humility, they rang hollow to many who had followed the story. The damage had already been done, and an apology, no matter how heartfelt, wasn't enough to undo the harm caused by his arrogance and lack of compassion. Shortly after the press conference, Nolan was forced to resign from his position. As he walked out of the restaurant for the last time, his head bowed in shame. The once proud manager was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the cost of ignoring humanity in favor of pride. The world moved on, but Nolan's story lingered as a testament to a simple, unyielding truth: kindness always triumphs, and arrogance will ultimately lead to one's downfall. A few weeks after the incident at the restaurant, Clara's life had completely transformed. On a crisp, chilly morning, she stood in front of a grand hotel owned by the Trump Organization, her new workplace. From being a server at a small restaurant, she now held a better-paying position in a professional environment where employees were treated with respect. Every morning, Clara took a few moments before starting her shift to silently thank God. Standing by the hotel window and gazing at the clear blue sky, she whispered, "Lord, thank you for guiding me. You turned challenges into blessings and opened doors I never dared to dream of." Clara's mother had received the medical treatment she needed with the financial help from the Trump family, and her younger sister now had the means to continue her education without worrying about tuition fees. Their once modest and burdened home was now filled with laughter and hope. Clara's story spread far and wide, becoming an inspiration about kindness and courage. During a television interview, when asked if she ever regretted her actions, Clara simply smiled and replied, "I have no regrets. When you do the right thing, God won't abandon you. I'm just an ordinary person, but I believe that every act of love creates an impact greater than we can imagine." Her story wasn't just a lesson in compassion, but a testament to God's justice. He sees everything and rewards those who live according to His will. Elsewhere, Barron Trump hadn't forgotten the young woman who had helped him during a difficult moment. He wrote Clara a heartfelt letter of thanks, including a line that moved her to tears. "Miss Clara, thank you for seeing me, not with your eyes, but with your heart. I hope one day I can spread kindness as you have." Clara folded the letter and held it tightly, keeping it as a reminder that true kindness is never wasted. The story closes with Clara stepping out of a church, having just attended a Thanksgiving service. She looked up at the sky, a bright smile on her face. In the gentle sunlight, it seemed as though a whisper echoed, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Matthew 25 verse 21. A new chapter in Clara's life had begun, but the light of her kindness would continue to shine, illuminating the lives of those around her.